David Taub with GV Wire, the special interview today. His tweets earlier this year set off a local and national debate on what is appropriate to tweet, on academic freedom, and on freedom of speech in general. Dr. Lars Maischak, Fresno State professor, let's just get right into it, the tweet that set off 1,000 debates.
Right.
You tweeted in February, to save American democracy, Trump must hang. The sooner, the higher, the better. Why did you tweet that? What did you mean by that?
In the Twitter feed that I've had, I was essentially using that as a scratch pad for my thoughts on where this country is headed, where it is politically headed, and the spirit of the Trump administration and its most hardcore supporters reminded me uncomfortably of the European fascist past that I've studied. The idea that you want to sort people by race and religion, that you reject equality, that you celebrate inequality, that you use government institutions not as an impartial framework, but as a weaponized thing to get loyalty, as in the case of the FBI, to get compliance from people. All of that is, to most observers who are not isolating themselves against that, inside a clear reminder of 1930s European fascism. And if that is the case, then, as one thesis, democracy is clearly in danger. The question then becomes, what happens when that is the case? How do you remedy that? And historically, oftentimes, if people have managed to rid themselves of movements and their influence like that, it has usually taken a violent form. That is not something that I advocated. That is not something that I wished for. I tried to explain, but nobody really seemed to be interested in that, rather in scandalizing the tone, that I was not advocating for that I was not wishing for that to happen, but that I was sort of channeling the moment, the movement in history, and where this was headed if people didn't think better, in my view.
True. I mean, a literal interpretation of the words. Did you even have that in mind when you said Trump must hang?
Right.
I mean, I don't think did you mean that literally?
I don't, if the current gist of the current momentum of the regime continues to undermine the civil rights of people who are not white, to diminish the role and the rights of women and so forth, that clearly swims in the same waters as European fascism. And I don't believe that Americans at large will go for that. It is a small, loud, and violent minority who want those things, but a majority of the people don't want that. They can still afford to be in denial that people are being harassed and intimidated and shouted down if they oppose that. But the methods, as was evidenced in Charlottesville the other day, the methods are those of the fascists of the 1930s. And the threats that are made, like against my person, by those same people. The guy who organized that rally in Charlottesville used to write for that same web page that first broke the story on my tweets and explained to people that, in fact, I had meant to incite violence.
But did you? I mean...
No.
So you had no intention of assassination, no attempt to harm anybody?
If I had been intent on assassinating the president, would I have said that he must hang? Have you ever heard about somebody assassinating somebody with a noose? No. But the logic of the regime is, if you get somebody in charge who follows down that authoritarian path and that hard right path, that is going to go against the essence of constitutional rule and democracy. And you have to set, if you have a large followership that runs along with it, that is not just going to go away if the government falls, if the regime falls. If you want to set a signal that it's over and that this is not acceptable, in the past, yes, people have taken these kinds of harsh steps of executing the leadership. But I don't want that. The entire path of my Twitter feed has been to say this is the logical path, that this is where this is headed. You can't possibly want it to go in this direction. So in other situations, I've set it up more clearly as a warning, as a dystopia, so to speak, as a dark prediction. And of course, the people who professionally ferret out professors to scandalize their words and paint them as crazy liberals and argue for their removal from their position do this for sport, and they get paid to do it. And again, the webpage that covered the story first, that created the storyline, that I had violent intent, one of their former writers was the organizer of that march in Charlottesville. So that tells you something. And there is a whole host of linked organizations: Campus Reform, Breitbart, the Daily Caller, the Professor Hit List, where they maintain profiles with addresses of people like me. But if I had had violent intentions, if I had advocated or planned to lynch and assassinate, as these people were saying, I wouldn't be sitting here. The Secret Service showed up at my door and did a pretty thorough investigation. And very clearly, they wouldn't have let me go if they had come to that same conclusion.
The initial tweet about Trump in question was in February. Breitbart picked up the story in April, and that's when all the fallout began. Did you expect this kind of fallout from a tweet that you made 2 months prior that may cost you your job? Was that what you expected?
Yes, in a way, knowing the hatred, knowing the bile on the web, knowing the ability and the intent of these types of propaganda sources on the web, like Breitbart and the Daily Caller, that is what they do. They whip up outrage to intimidate people and to threaten. It's a death threat machine. It's a dial a death threat thing. You have a professor you don't like, find something about him, get somebody on the case, and you just might be lucky that the university administration is going to play your game. And in this case, what surprised me the most was the willingness of Fresno State to play along with it. So they echoed the language, the accusatory, inflammatory language of my critics, that of course took these tweets out of context, scandalized them, and explained to their followers that I was their enemy and that I was out to get them.
Right. Now, Fresno State called your tweet inconsistent with the core values of our university.
Right. Fresno State didn't just throw me under the bus, they helped build that bus. So they did not acknowledge that the people who attacked me are part of an organized, coordinated, well-financed, nationwide campaign. I'm not the only one who was given that kind of treatment. I might have made it too easy because of the tone of the tweets, and it might have been too easy for them to twist it in that fashion. But for heaven's sake, I tweeted that to 28 people. The collegian here at Fresno State interviewed some of my Twitter followers. No, it was clear to everybody who read that in context, and even just the language, that this was not an incitement to violence. In fact, many people at the time pointed that out. So moreover, the procedure of having in the court of public opinion an instantaneous accusation, trial, conviction, and sentencing without a hearing to the person accused strikes me as violating most people's sense of justice. So Fresno State would have had the job to point out the context here and to say these are people who are professional hitmen, who wield the threat of intimidation, harassment, and so forth to make life difficult for people they disagree with and to increase the likelihood that more people like me will keep their mouths shut.
Now, you said you have 28 followers. And did you ever intend for your tweets to go beyond that?
No. I mean, I tried to bat down the trolls, and I guess I didn't know that you could have just set it to private. Whenever somebody who I didn't know found the Twitter account, I tried to block them and so forth. I used to write down these kinds of, this thought process, these running ideas of where is this headed, what are my theses about the nature of the country at the time and this movement on coasters in the bar. And Twitter seemed to be a good format because you can run it by a couple of people. But if I had wanted to run a campaign of lynching Republicans, like they were saying, and assassinating the president, I sure would have come up, you'd hope, with a more effective way of doing that than trying to keep it private. So, no, I mean, that's not the point. The point is that academic freedom entails the right to do things that are going to upset people. And if we don't do that, then we are not doing our job. And Fresno State is financed by people who have a very clear sense that if the professors there say things they don't like, then they get to intervene. They were doing that when the chair of the history department linked Mr. Trump to Dylann Roof, the assassin in Charleston. There was a series of tweets by local notables saying, well, I don't want that kind of people teaching on my money. And a university's job is to say, you're not sugar daddies, you're benefactors. If you want performance in return for your money, then you need to find somebody else to finance this operation.
Now, does the community have the right to say we're offended?
Yeah.
I mean, because clearly they were offended. You can just take a look at the social media, Twitter, Facebook. They didn't like your tweets, the other tweets from other professors. So, can they, in essence, vote with their money? They say if, Fresno State keeps on Professor Maischak, they keep on these other professors, we're not going to donate. Is that fair?
Yes, of course. If that's how they want higher education to function, if they think you give money and you get your opinion echoed back at you in return, I don't think a university with any kind of self-respect should take that money. Because we would not be doing our job if we don't offend on occasion. If we just talk after the mouth.
Dr. Maischak, where's the line? I mean, if somebody...
The line is where laws are broken. The line is where actually somebody says, I want there to be violence. I want there to be people lynched. Of course. But I did not break any laws. Because if I had broken those kinds of laws, I would now be dealing with the authorities. I've dealt with the authorities, and they've concluded that I haven't broken any laws.
Would it be appropriate for a professor to say something racially disparaging about blacks or Jews and still expect to have a job on campus?
How is that the same?
We're talking about things that might be offensive to some that are radical to some.
There is offensiveness, and then there is stuff that is not based on scientific evidence and argument. If you're saying that women or Africans are inferior to white people, you're going against any valid conclusions of science. If I'm saying, based on my knowledge as a historian, the content of the hardcore supporters of the present government, the ideas and the policies and all that, partake of the same spirit and share some of the essential goals of European fascism in the 1930s, then that is a fact. It might be offensive to people, but the offensive part is that they have embraced an ideology that has already done so much damage in the world, and that should never have reared its ugly head again. So it is not an equivalence. Just because somebody is offended doesn't make it the same thing. People get offended for all kinds of reasons. We need to talk about the merit of the argument. Yes, if somebody is saying, I'm going to explain against the backdrop, like the historical arguments that white supremacists make, that these proponents of the white man's burden make a broad argument, like Samuel Huntington does, that Western civilization is somehow superior to the cultures of Africa and Asia. I would be happy to debate that. In fact, I've attended a Samuel Huntington speech in Berlin where that was debated. But that is different from saying, in our country, in our society, we have individuals who we consider second-rate, second-class, because of their skin color, because of their national or religious background, and who we want to exclude from certain rights and privileges, or from membership in this community. So to point that out might offend people who wish to exclude, who wish to diminish other people's rights. But I'm happy to offend them. I want to cite Franklin Roosevelt here. I welcome the hatred. Because I think that, historically speaking, I'm on the right side. And I'm on the side that, speaking as a German, that America has been on historically. When my family saw the first American tank roll down the street in 1945, that is when people said, well, we finally can breathe free again. We finally can speak our mind again. We can just take a deep breath and we can feel safe. So for people in this country to feel unsafe, to have to look over their shoulder whether ICE is going to pick up their dad or their kid, to feel like you're not accepted because on the Daily Caller and other websites like that, the marching orders are make the brown people uncomfortable, make the black people uncomfortable, put the women in their place, let them know that we're now in charge. That is not the spirit that attracts me to American history. That is not why I love this place, why I moved here, why I studied its history from the very first day in college, and why I would defend these core values of free speech, especially if people who have affinities with the darkest parts of European history feel offended by them. So this is not something that comes down to disciplinary action and professional conduct. This comes down to core values and what side of history you want to be on. And just to conclude here, to give you the full picture of the role of Fresno State, you know their public response, but their private response to me, they never talked to me, they never were interested in the content, in my explanation for what these tweets meant and what I had meant by them, and what I had intended by them, sorry. But when I called them, when they first actually talked to me about 6 days in, the first thing they said was, well, we thought you might address any security concerns you have by tendering your voluntary resignation. Or in plain English, if you don't like getting killed, why don't you quit your job? So that kind of callousness, that kind of complicity with the death threat machine, to leverage that to get rid of an employee that is an embarrassment to them in front of their sponsors, that is low. And that is, Fresno is better than that. Fresno State is better than that. And this is part of the story I have not been able to tell because I had to protect myself and my employment against that vitriol and that hatred. But I have been eager. I haven't said anything for 4 months. I don't want to call out Fresno State. I don't want to badmouth them. I love that workplace. I love the students and my colleagues there. And I have respect for the institution. But they don't leave me much of a choice if they're giving me that third-class burial.
Now, have you received these threats? Has you think your safety has been jeopardized ever since this incident?
I've reported every threat to the competent authorities, and I don't think I should comment on the specifics of responses.
But you have been threatened?
Oh, I've received threats in the hundreds, yes.
By emails, maybe?
By email and by Twitter. In the thousands on Twitter, I didn't read them all. I didn't respond to them all either.
Any physical threats at all?
I have not been physically assaulted, but I think that good police work is always going to be an important part of that.
Do you still feel for you and your family's safety?
Yes, I do feel safe, but what does that have to do with it? If I gave in to the violence, as Fresno State has done, if I folded and slunk away, they're already celebrating. At Breitbart, the champagne is flowing, the corks are popping. If you give in to that violence, as Fresno State has done, if you're tugging in your tail and saying, oh, offensive language, it is a nationwide campaign. There's dozens of people like me. It is going to get worse from here if you don't stand up to that. And those universities that turned around and said to the accusers, are you kidding? Is this supposed to be some kind of joke? Of course we're protecting this person's right to speak their mind. They've had the least trouble. They haven't had to shut down their campus. If you show weakness, if you give credence to the accusations, if you don't call them out as part of an organized far-right campaign to intimidate not just academics, also journalists, people in theater. You remember the Shakespeare performance in New York, where everybody with anything Shakespeare-related in their name received death threats, consequently, around the nation. The Jewish woman in Montana who thought she'd reach out to her conservative neighbors to show that America is still an inclusive place, only to be hit with a nationwide death threat campaign orchestrated by the Daily Stormer. Those are all cases of where the far right is now flexing its muscle and trying to assert through the threat of violence, and in Charlottesville at least one case of actual murder, that people like me shut up and get the hell out of my country, as people would tell me.
Do you think there's a double standard at all? If somebody tweeted Obama should hang, whether they're taken in context or out of context, and they're a professor on a campus, do you think there would be the same uproar?
Is there a left-wing organization that is maintaining a professor watch list, that is asking people to report things that right-wing professors have said? Is that a well-financed thing that gets bankrolled by, I think the professor watch list gets money from the DeVos Family Foundation?
But if somebody says Obama should hang, or, white people this, white people that, who are saying something disparaging like that, you don't think there'd be scrutiny and criticism of them?
Of course there should be criticism. I don't mind the criticism. I like the criticism. I want to be wrong. Ideally, I would love nothing.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people think you're wrong there.
I would love nothing more than to be proven wrong by the course of history. But I am going to put my theses out there. I am going to say what, in my view, where this is headed and what spirit this partakes of. So if the free speech argument that the right is currently making is one where they're saying, we are not being heard, we are being shouted down. But there is a difference between saying Trump is a fascist and a black person is inferior. Because one is, you can be upset about that, but you can make a scholarly argument and you can have a scholarly debate over whether it's true, whereas the other is clearly not true.
Now, a couple days after the Breitbart story, you sent a message to the media, said that you are appalled by the president of the university for allowing himself to be instrumentalized for a right-wing smear campaign. And then a couple days after that, you sent another message saying that you apologize for the tone and content of your statements on Twitter. Well, why did you apologize a couple days later when you feel pretty strongly about your rights to do so?
I apologize because I realized that nobody was interested in hearing my side of the story, and for all practical purposes, people out there just knew that I was out to get them and that I wanted to kill Trump. So that is an injury to people, and that deserves an apology. Never mind that I didn't say that, never mind that I didn't do that, but I don't want people to feel threatened. I don't want people to feel unsafe, not even people, and especially not people who I disagree with. So to those people who sent me emails that clearly were filled with dread over their safety, over the author's safety, and concern for the safety of Mr. Trump, for whom they expressed love and admiration, I don't want to do that to people, So if I don't get a chance to set the record straight at the time, and there was no chance I was going to, then at the very least, I can make sure that the people who felt the most offended get some kind of satisfaction.
Did you have any direct interaction with Dr. Castro and all this? Did you guys speak either in person or on the phone?
No.
So even though he made public statements about you, about the future of employment, he never contacted you directly?
No.
Who did you deal with at the university?
The provost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now.
So and over the 4 months since April, I've waited for the university to make things right, because I was willing to say, fine, if you think I'm untenable here because I'm going to be an embarrassment to you with your friends, with money, I'm sure you agree that I'm a good teacher. I'm sure because I don't think that anybody can argue otherwise. I'm sure you agree that I should be employed and that this should not be grounds for firing me. So can you work with me and make sure that I get to work someplace else in the system, if not in Fresno? And they more or less stonewalled that up until the last moment when they reassigned me to stuffing envelopes, essentially. But in the course of the back and forth between our lawyers, I kept hearing that argument on their side. Well, isn't he afraid? So throughout this whole process, they were still trying to leverage the death threats to get rid of him. And that, I can't say this often enough, this is low. This is not really how this university should be run. And I think most people who think about this for a minute will find that offensive. And the student body at Fresno State, even most of the sponsors, the ordinary decent sponsors, who believe in higher education not as something that flatters them and echoes their views and idiosyncrasies will find that wrong.
Are there any particular donors that you know of that wanted you out?
I can't speak to that.
Okay. So what does your future hold now? I mean, you've been, in essence, on voluntary leave ever since the Breitbart story came out in April. This semester, you were scheduled to teach your classes in the classroom, and you're not going to be doing that. You're still on paid leave. You're still getting paid. Your contract runs through the end of the semester at the from next year. What is your future? Do you think you're going to stay at Fresno State?
I don't know what my future holds.
Do you want to still teach at Fresno State?
I do want to teach at Fresno State. I would have wanted to teach in the fall. In fact, I've said that if you get protests, if you get people who want me out, I would love nothing more than to invite them into one of the auditoriums, pass out my reading for the first class of History 11, which is usually John Winthrop's sermon, a model of Christian charity, and simply do my first class of that History 11 seminar. So if people then still think I'm a crazy lefty who discriminates against Republicans in the classroom and doesn't give conservative views fair play and recognition, so be it. But I think I could easily prove them wrong by simply doing what I always do. So yes, of course, I want to be teaching. But this is not about me and my professional future. I may be toast, especially if I go on record speaking truth to power about my employer. Clearly, I don't believe that these people want me working there. And I think they're ruthless and they're wrong. But don't be worried about my future. Be worried about the future of your country.
Knowing the fallout, the effect on your employment, everything that you have gone through, would you have done this again? Would you tweet, Trump must hang?
I would never again use Twitter because it is far too easy with the truncated 144-letter format or character format for that to not fully say what you intend and for that to be twisted around. So I think social media is useless for debate and for developing arguments. I do, however, still want to finish my book, or at least lengthy paper, laying out the thesis why, yes, of course, not only can you say that the present government is walking in the same path as 1930s European fascism, but you should say that, because that makes it clearer and that is more truthful to sidestep that.
And finally, anything else you want to say in conclusion?
Can't think of anything right now, but the one thing that is clear, if I lose my job, if I don't go back to the classroom, this is not the end of my career. This is the beginning of a stepped up effort by the right to silence people, to get rid of them. And if you want to live in a pluralistic society where you have freedom of speech and where people can go about their business without fear of intimidation and harassment, then you should not be okay with me getting shipped off to who knows where.
All right, Dr.
And
Lars.
being removed from the classroom.
Dr. Lars Maischak, thank you so much for joining us here on GV Wire.
Thanks.